Hi, this is Samantha again from The Neuronarrative. And to reintroduce myself, I'm a therapist in California and I specialize in neurodivergence and also complex trauma. Before we get started, I just wanted to share these fun earrings. They actually reminded me of being, neurospicy. I don't really use that term a lot. And that's why I'm wearing these today, because we're going to be talking about the myths and misconceptions of autism. And there is a lot of them. I'm not going to talk about every single myth that I know. I'm going to talk about 3 big ones. Now, the first myth is that autistic people can't feel emotions. Now, this is totally wrong. If you're a human, you have emotions. Even psychopaths and sociopaths, they feel something. Maybe not empathy. Maybe not every human feels empathy, for instance, but emotion is a human trait. And also with people with autism. Now, I'm going to talk about this term called alexithymia. Have you heard of it? And this gets misread as someone who doesn't have emotions. Now, if you ask someone with alexithymia, and by the way, it's like 40% among autistic people who have it, but if it's wrong, I'll put it in the screen here. I just have to double check. But if you ask someone with alexithymia, how do you feel? Where does it feel? They might say, I don't know. Now, it doesn't mean they don't feel. They just have a hard time describing what they're feeling. And that's a big difference than not having any emotions. Okay, I had to pull up more foam here because there's like chainsaw noises outside. There's like the gardeners next door. Anyway, something I will share is some psychoeducation with them. And I'll explain that words are just one way, like one output to express your emotions. And there's so many ways you can without the use of words or needing to label it. These are things like art, music, maybe the way they stim in certain situations. Something I like to start with folks who, especially if they have trouble reading their body sensations, and body sensations is a way to access emotions, but if they have a hard time with that, I might say, what does your fingertips feel? Or we might do some experiments, like if you rub them together or tap them together, what do you notice? Now, with a big component of autism, there is challenges with social communication, which is part of the myth that they don't have feelings. So, for instance, if they have a certain tone, maybe that's very monotone, the other person, or maybe like a neurotypical person, might interpret that as they don't have any feelings or that they don't care. Or if they're stimming, that maybe the neurotypical person thinks that they're detached when actually the stimming is helping them listen better. So naturally, a lot of autistic people have difficulty expressing. Now, maybe some of them resort to masking to fit in, but maybe the natural way they express, tends to get misread a lot. This could be, why aren't they in distress when something that a neurotypical person might feel is a distressful situation, or they might be confused as to why are they distressed when something shouldn't be a big deal. If you're a person who loves someone with autism or knows someone with autism, make sure you ask before you assume, and please require patience and understanding. Now, the second myth I'll share is that ABA is the only therapy out there for autistic folks. You know what? I hate to say it, but I used to think this. I have a sibling with high support needs, and they had to go through ABA in the 90s. And for a while, it was the only thing that most people knew, even therapists knew about. But this is simply not true. Let me tell you, I have some beef with ABA. That means applied behavioral analysis. And I actually used to be a behavioral therapist once upon a time. This was before getting my master's. I've always wanted to be a therapist, but I had my bachelor's in psychology, and there's only so much you could do. So I decided to test the waters with doing behavioral therapy because you could do that with a bachelor's degree. And I did not like it. I thought it was really unethical. I was not there that long. And later it made sense, this idea of masking. And what ABA does is that it focuses on behaviors rather than really the issue at hand, which is, I think, that autism is a nervous system issue. So traditional ABA, what they do is they try to diminish behaviors that are not aligned with neurotypical behaviors, such as stimming or meltdowns, tantrums. There's even a saying called quiet hands. So you're not allowed to fidget, you're not allowed to stim, you're supposed to be good and quiet is good. I'm not saying autistic people can't learn skills. Of course they can learn skills. But this this whole thing about being so rigid in behavior and they have to conform a certain way. I remember this kid who was nonverbal, and I remember I had to specifically teach this, like this as open. I think that's what it was, but the kid wanted to do this. He understood that we were working on open, and he wanted to do this. But I remember, I guess like the manager was like, no, he has to do it this way. And I remember him being so frustrated and so upset that, he couldn't communicate the way he wanted. And even though I understood him, and anyway, it was just really painful to see these kids like constantly not listened to, constantly dysregulated, even more than they already were. Instead of working on that dysregulation or meeting to where they're at that time. Now, ABA is considered the gold standard, and I think it's still known that today. Now, let me tell you a little secret as a therapist. Now, you hear things like CBT, ABA, these are behavioralism type of therapies, and there is more research in it, but it doesn't mean it's necessarily better. And I'm not trying to bag on cognitive behavioral therapy either, but these are very highly funded. They've been out a long time, and science is very slow. Like research is really slow. So a lot of the things that are very effective these days is not really recommended as, they're not really out there in the mainstream. So just because something has research doesn't mean it's quite better. Actually, a lot of research with behavioral types of therapy, it's usually with boys, especially with autism. They really only looked at young white boys and not a lot of long-term results. Like they were looking at more like short-term results as opposed to the long-term. So ABA is not necessarily the best. I think it's problematic. I could go more into it, but I won't. But I'm going to tell you some alternatives. I like to teach emotional regulation techniques, and there are so many ways to do that, but I like to focus on the nervous system. I like to focus even on the trauma that they've experienced, whether that's from, social trauma, like being bullied or being ignored. Actually, I like to look at their sensory profile, and that's a whole thing. But do they have certain sensory issues? Because that's a big factor in if they get dysregulated or not. And there are things like speech therapy, occupational therapy, joining support groups, having just maybe a free-flowing type of therapy like playtime, play therapy. Also, there are strength-based types of therapy, so relying on their strengths and passions. The last myth I'll go over is that autism is overdiagnosed. And this is so annoying when people go up to me or I talk about the work I do and they're like, doesn't everyone have autism? No, let me tell you why. Quick history lesson. So autism was added to the DSM, which is like the Bible for therapists and mental disorders, in 1980. But humans have always had autism. Autism has always existed. It just had different names before. And usually they were very insulting or harmful names. So a big part of this misconception, let's go back to that research I was talking about. And in that research, in a lot of this research with autism, the pool was very limited. You know why? Because they were looking at young white boys. And maybe if you have autism yourself, and I'm not sure if you've ever had someone invalidate you by saying, oh, you're not autistic, you're not like my 5-year-old nephew, he's nonverbal, now that's autism. Well, that's mainly what they were looking at, and kind of leaving out so many other populations of people, such as women, people of color. That's another misconception itself, that males are more likely to have autism. And these days, they are recognizing that it isn't just a male disorder or condition, just as many females can have it too. And part of this reason is that, one, in society, a lot of research and a lot of things women were left out. And women have a different profile usually. Part of this is societal. For instance, women are better at masking. There's more societal pressure to do so. And also, they just were left out more. They weren't as, cared about as much. So now they recognize, there's different features, maybe depending on culture or the gender of someone or their ethnicity. Another major thing is technology and just, more knowledge these days of what autism is. Let me give you another history example, because I like history. The civil rights movement, in the 50s, what happened technology-wise? People started having television, so people were more aware of what was happening in the country instead of being a bit more closed-minded to what's going on in their community. And this was a big component to understanding racism, right? So, kind of similar with the internet, we're just more connected in that way. There's a lot more access, free access to certain information. You can Google whatever and you get an answer right away. YouTube, right? The professionals are more knowledgeable about it. I mean, it could be better in the medical world and the therapy world, but people just have more knowledge about it these days. So they see something, they resonate, and they go and they see a psychologist and they get tested. And, they just don't give it to you willy-nilly. It's like a big commitment. They do lots of, it's a big procedure, like doing the test. There's all these things. I won't go into it. And there's a lot of people who are not diagnosed for whatever reason. I know people who refuse to get a test because they're afraid of the stigma, or perhaps it's too much money. Lastly, with this misconception that autism is overdiagnosed, is that people look too much into the particular traits and, maybe one trait, and they said, well, someone's got this. Now, they have their own, autism has its own brain structure. It has its own criteria. But, some of the traits do overlap with other conditions like OCD and ADHD. And it's also possible to have multiple mental health conditions. I mean, this is why I think it's important to see a professional about this, or at least do some self-testing in looking into some research if you think you have autism. But, something like, OCD, worrying, of course everyone worries, or anxiety. Everyone's anxious sometimes, but at what level and where's that anxiety come from? They just look at one trait and they think, oh yeah, that applies to everyone. So I'll stop there for today. Again, there's more myths. I may have gone on a rant with some of these, but I'm just really passionate myself about this topic. It's the work that I do. And if you found this content valuable, feel free to subscribe, give it a like. If there's anything relatable in the video you found, feel free to comment if there's a critique. And I'll see you guys later.